My name is Mariana Smith, and I am an assistant professor of visual art at Stockton University. And today it is my honor to introduce the panel that is a discussion event in commemoration of 106th anniversary of Armenian Genocide. The panel is introduced by the Visual Arts and Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Stockton University. This is an important and momentous conversation, especially considering that America finally had joined in acknowledging that it is indeed an event that was a genocide. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Ryann Casey, who is Philadelphia, New Jersey-based artist. She's curator and educator, and she works as an adjunct professor of photography, art history, and critical theory at Stockton University, MCCC, and Rowan College. Ryann holds a BA in photography with a minor in gender studies from Stockton University and an MFA and MS in photography and art history from the Pratt Institute. I had an honor and privilege to work with Ryann on several projects, and she is a notable curator and a fantastic artist who works with national and international artists. She will moderate our discussion and introduce our presenters, who Allan, Arpajian, and Susan Arpajian Jolley, who are the authors out of My Great Sorrows, the book Armenian Genocide, and artist Mary Zakarian, and Dr. Asya Darbinyan, a visiting research scholar at Clark University, and artist Deanna Marcussen and Silvina del Meguerditchian. The presentations will address various aspects and the narratives connected to the history and stories of Armenian genocide, but also they are a preview of the exhibition that will open up in fall 2021 at Stockton University. And this commemoration is generously supported by the sponsors of Stockton University that include the School of General Studies, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies minor, Jewish Studies minor, Gerald and Claire Weinstein Professorship in Jewish Studies, Migration Studies minor, and the Sarah and Sam Schoffer Holocaust Resource Center. With that, I would like to leave the stage and pass the microphone to Ryann. And my job now is going to be to field the questions. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Ryann Casey. As Mariana mentioned, I am an adjunct professor here at Stockton University. I'm also an alumni, so I've been here for a long time. So what I wanted to do first is just sort of introduce everybody, but also to give you a little bit of a background on the show. As I said, I'm an adjunct professor here at Stockton, and I've curated here before, and there's such a wonderful community here, not only for the arts, but just in terms of community outreach. I'm just so happy to be able to do this again. I'm curating an upcoming fall exhibition that Mariana mentioned, entitled Before After Reflections on the Armenian Genocide. And it opens on September 7th. It's on view through October 17th in the upper gallery. The exhibition will feature 11 artists, in fact, 3 of which will be highlighted in this panel, and we'll trace Armenian resiliency through the common threads of things like loss, survival, migration, and history. Before and After focuses on the Armenian experience, past and present, and integrates witness accounts with recreation, and will reflect the repeating patterns of things like grief and healing. I'm so honored to be part of this panel, as well as a curator for the exhibition, and I'm very honored to introduce our first panelist. Dr. Asya Darbinyan, currently a visiting scholar at Clark University, was a fellow in Holocaust and Genocide Studies here at Stockton University. She completed a PhD in history at the Strasser Center for the Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University as well in December of 2019. Darbinyan worked at the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute as a senior research fellow and the deputy director of the museum between 2008 and 2013. I'm also going to introduce our other panelists before we move over. That way we can just sort of move along as we go. Silvina deals with issues related to the burden of national identity, the role of minorities in society, and the potential of space of the in-between. She's interested in the impact of migration on urban texture and its consequences. Reconstruction of the past and building of archives is a thread through most of her artistic research. She's been shown in exhibitions around the world, including Germany, Argentina, Turkey, and the United States. Deanna Marcussen takes an intimate approach to photography and video storytelling, which is both conceptual and documentary. She's been featured in National Geographic Magazine, the New Yorker, and the New York Times. She also has a number of books as well. And she holds a master's degree from Columbia University in New York. Allan and Susan are co-authors of Out of My Great Sorrows, The Armenian Genocide, and Mary Zakarian. Allan received a Bachelor of Arts degree and the Master's of Arts degree in musicology from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the Bachelor of Science degrees in computer science. Susan received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from the University of Pennsylvania, and she retired in 2013 after a long teaching career in English in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, most recently in Delaware High School. She also taught piano in her home in Delaware for 30 years and has published articles in education journals, including the English Journal, Classroom Notes, and Transformation. I will also say Allan also worked as a computer analyst and retired in 2009. And that's most of our panelists. I'll be back in a few minutes after we go through all of our different stories. And then, as always, please make sure that you add questions for our panelists. We have a really robust Q&A at the end, so we'd love to hear from you. All right, so I'm going to pass it to Asya to begin.
Thank you, Ryan, for your kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this fascinating panel. I'm delighted to be back to Stockton University, even if it's only virtually. Because I have very limited time, I will just go ahead to share my screen and get to my presentation. I was asked to present the history of Armenian genocide, which I usually teach in one semester at least. So let's go. I will address 4 major questions today. What is genocide? What did pave the way for the Armenian genocide? How was the genocide carried out? And what happens after the genocide? Genocide is a crime. It is a term coined by international lawyer Raphael Lemkin to define, condemn, and punish a crime with no name. Yet genocide is so much more than just a crime or a term. It is an attack on the lives, homes, culture, identity, agency, and dignity of a people. Genocide is an experience and a process that does not begin or end with the act of killing. It impacts generations. Each and every genocide is unique for the people who experience it, who are forced to overcome that trauma and deal with its consequences, who remember and commemorate it. The Armenian genocide, orchestrated and systematically implemented by the Ottoman government under the cover of the First World War, was a disaster, arret, that inflicted tremendous suffering and pain upon a people. It took over 1.5 million lives, triggered huge population movements, and left hundreds of thousands of Armenians as well as Assyrians and Greeks without home and hope. Karos Asuni, an Armenian relief worker, witnessed the mass population movements at the Ottoman-Russian border regions in summer 1915. He lamented, and I quote, "From now on, the word refugee, Gakhtakan, has become a synonym for a Turkish Armenian, a miserable and desperate person." End quote. We will get back to this description of a refugee as a miserable and desperate person towards the end of my presentation, but let's here pay attention also to the map. This is the map that Karos Asuni drew, trying to capture the directions in which the Armenian refugees fled the eastern provinces of Ottoman Empire like Van, Bitlis, and Erzurum, and to show how they reached the Caucasus, seeking for temporary shelter, food, and medical assistance. Little did they know that they were never going to return back home. Another map that we can have a look now will help us to zoom out and look at the bigger picture both geographically and also historically. The Ottoman Empire, which ruled over vast territories from North Africa and Europe to Asia Minor and the Caucasus in the past, was gradually declining, and by the 19th century was called the sick man of Europe. The European powers kept pushing the sultans to implement reforms that, according to the European powers, would help the Ottomans to modernize and save the country from a further decline. These reforms entailed granting equal rights to all Muslim and non-Muslim subjects of the empire. See, Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, Jews were secondary citizens in the empire. They were deprived of right to serve in the army or bear arms, testify in court. They were double or triple taxed by the government, the municipal powers, the Kurdish landlords and tribesmen. The Armenian church was given some autonomy over the Armenian internal affairs, like community affairs, but itself was subordinate to the government. So it preached acceptance of the fate befallen the Armenians and strongly opposed any attempts of resistance. While the sultans initially welcomed those calls of European powers for change and agreed to some reforms during the Tanzimat period, in practice, they were reluctant to implement those reforms. Instead, they reinforced the system of inferiority of non-Muslim subjects. If the latter refused to follow the rules or obey the discriminating laws and practices, or if they attempted to resist any attacks on their families, properties, and possessions, these actions were labeled as treacherous and were followed by pogroms, massacres, looting, and plunder. In the 1890s, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, also known in the West as the Bloody Sultan, was once again urged to implement the promised reforms. Yet instead, in 1894-96, about 300,000 Armenians in various parts of the empire fell victim to massacres on his watch. European ambassadors in Constantinople, shocked by the bloodshed in the streets of the imperial capital, sent a note to Sultan Abdul Hamid demanding immediate end of massacres. The killings stopped, but this toxic atmosphere of inequality, hostility towards the non-Muslims, and most importantly, the impunity would pave the way for the new crimes against humanity in the Ottoman state and eventually peak during the First World War in a form of systematically implemented genocide. After the 1908 coup d'etat by the Young Turks, the Ottoman constitution was restored. The non-Muslim subjects celebrated this event in every corner of the empire with hopes for long-awaited equality, freedom, justice. For instance, Armenians started reopening their educational institutions, participating in political and social life more actively, and even were allowed to serve in the army. Meanwhile, for the conservative Muslim population, this new era of constitutional order threatened their traditional relationship with the Armenians and other non-Muslims. No wonder, just a year after the coup, in spring 1909, another wave of massacres against Armenians took place in Adana, accompanied by plunder and destruction of the city. Gradually, the attitude of the new government towards Armenians was shifting. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire lost almost all of its European territories in the Balkan Wars, as this map shows. And because of these losses, the CUP shifted its attention from the west to east, focusing on the waves of Muslim refugees pouring in from the Balkans. Many of them were resettled in Anatolia, in eastern provinces of empire, causing more instability in the towns and villages that were mostly populated by Armenians. On the eve of the First World War, Ottoman Empire had no more, or maybe a little bit more than 2 million Armenian subjects, while the empire's overall population was over 17 million. Hence, Armenians were a small minority to present any kind of real threat to the empire. Yet the losses in Balkan wars had a devastating emotional impact on the young Turkish leaders. And at the beginning of World War I, Armenians, as well as Assyrians, Greeks, were seen as an internal enemy, a threat to the integrity of the Ottoman state. Another reason for the Turkish leadership's growing hostility towards Armenians was the reform project. Inspired by the success of the Balkan states, Armenians were asking the Ottoman government for the long-promised reforms. It's crucial to understand that, unlike the Balkan states and the Balkan nations, Armenians did not push for separation or for independent state. All they requested was the promised reforms and equal rights. And while the great powers were in the middle of discussing the reform project, the First World War waged in the fall of 1914, and the reforms remain on the paper. The Ottoman government used the cover of the war to bring the Armenian question to its final solution. We're looking at the map of the Armenian Genocide that shows the main killing sites, deportation routes, concentration camps, etc. The genocide was carried out stage by stage. First, Ottomans aimed to deprive the Armenians of leadership, of their will or ability to unite and resist. This process started with the arrest of prominent Armenians of Constantinople, the intellectuals, on April 24, 1915, hence the day of the commemoration of Armenian Genocide. These intellectuals were then transported to Ankara, present-day Turkish capital, and they were eventually killed. Another important step for the Ottoman government in the implementation of their genocidal plan was the disarmament of Armenian men, conscripted to the Ottoman army. So when the war started, the Ottoman Armenians joined the army to fight against Ottoman Empire's enemies, Russian Empire, other Entente powers. However, they were drafted into labor battalions already from October 1914 and either died of exhaustion and starvation while working on railway constructions, or were taken away in groups and executed. The deportation of Armenian women, children, and the elderly to the Syrian deserts was the next stage. The government justified this policy as military necessity and called it relocation. Yet, according to both the foreign witness accounts and the survivors' accounts, these were death marches. Those who survived the deportations were placed in concentration camps in Aleppo and the adjacent areas. There, many were eventually targeted and massacred. It was the second phase of the genocide, extending from summer to December 1916, resulting in destruction of Armenians in the concentration camps of Syrian deserts. And that's why here on the map, on the southern part of the map, you see those black circles, like in Deir Zor, Rasulayn, and Raqqa. The genocidal methods varied from place to place. We're talking about regional practices. From western and central provinces, Armenians were deported to the deserts. In eastern provinces, the scene was different. That's why you see on this map those large circles in red, which are the killing sites, those which are closer to the Ottoman-Russian border. Most of the Armenians in Bitlis and Mush, for example, were killed in their home vilayets. Very few were deported. We learn from the survivors' accounts how they witnessed their family members being sealed inside churches, homes, or barns and burned alive. Armenians of Black Sea port area from Trabzon, about 15,000 of them, were deported, but many were arrested, taken by ship out to sea and drowned. And that's why, again, on this map, you see those red arrows pointed towards the Black Sea and some red circles because they were drowned and killed right there. So genocide scholar and my dissertation advisor, Taner Akçam, has uncovered the dual track mechanism of implementation of the genocidal policies by Ottoman state. The CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, ordered and communicated the information through official and unofficial channels. Official orders went through government channels, and they stated about deportation and relocation alone. Unofficial orders went through alternative network of party and personal communications and authorized to commit violence on grand scale. This mechanism was purposefully utilized to carry out destructive anti-Armenian actions. See here the pictures of Talat, Enver, Cemal, Bahaddin Shakir Bey. They were the leaders of Young Turkish government and the orchestrators of the genocide. On November 1st, 1918, after the Ottoman Empire surrendered to Allied powers, these Young Turkish leaders escaped. They fled the country. So when the court, military tribunal established in Istanbul, found the heads of the previous government guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced them to death, it was in absentia. Local participation in the killing and looting of the Armenian population was another crucial aspect of Armenian genocide. The property of Armenians was distributed among the Muslim tribes and refugees from the Balkans. These were incentives for mass participation in the genocidal process allowed by the government. The spoils of war, plundering of Armenian property, near free access to females and minors. The CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, openly encouraged Ottoman Muslim households to abduct Armenian women and children with a goal to, quote unquote, remake them into proper Ottomans. This is a picture of Armenian young women who were abducted into Muslim households during the genocide and later liberated and placed in a shelter to recover from their trauma. They hold a banner which says, "We are sisters in sorrow." You can see here some resemblance with actually the theme of the event, because we're going to talk about Mir Zakharyan's story, and the book is also titled Out of My Great Sorrow. So this topic, this theme of sorrow is in a lot of accounts and memoirs of genocide survivors. And while some Armenians tried to save themselves and their families by converting to Islam, soon those mass conversions were banned, and the Armenians who had converted were also ordered to be deported and killed. By the act of genocide, the Young Turks prepared the ground for the Turkish national state, the republic that would be founded by Mustafa Kemal. The Turkish nationalists gained a homeland for Turkish people. The successive Turkish regimes were successful in denying the crime of genocide and gaining international recognition of their rights to the territory that once made up the heartland of Armenian kingdoms. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Armenians, who mostly by chance or due to their perseverance survived the genocide and fled the Ottoman Turkish state, scattered all over the world, becoming refugees in Europe, US, Middle East, Caucasus, Australia, South America, and elsewhere. For many years, genocide studies in general, and Armenian genocide research in particular, aimed at proving the crime of genocide by analyzing foreign sources and largely neglecting the voices of survivors. After all, even the United States government took 106 years to call the crime by its name, a genocide. The Turkish state's continuous denial of genocide too has had an impact on the academic research on this topic. As historian Rebecca Jinks has explained, and I will quote her, the few accounts of Western witnesses to the Armenian genocide are celebrated by the Armenian community largely because of the value of their assumed impartiality in rebutting Turkish denial, end quote. Hence, those who actually went through the hardships of forced displacement, attacks on their houses and families, rape, abduction, forced conversion, starvation, exhaustion, and epidemics were marginalized, and their words were considered less worthy of analysis. Humiliated and dehumanized by perpetrators, ignored and betrayed by the bystanders, the survivors of genocide and victims of war once again were neglected, now by historians, legal scholars, political scientists, and even by their descendants who would not bring the refugee survivors' testimony to the table, fearing that it might, quote unquote, compromise their case. But if we do examine these accounts, we learn more not only about their experiences of suffering and pain. Their voices help us understand the role these deportees and refugees played in the survival of the remains of Armenian nation. We realize that, contrary to Karo Sassouni's description, the Gahtakan, or the Turkish Armenian refugee, was not just a miserable and desperate person. We learn that many of the adult refugees were quite helpful and active in refugee camps, in classrooms and workshops teaching and training refugee children while the genocide was still unfolding. We see that many of the exhausted, abandoned, and sick children were not just savage-like creatures ready to attack for a piece of bread, as described by some of foreign witnesses. A number of children were self-reliant and demonstrated a great sense of self-organization and even leadership if necessary. Therefore, to truly study and understand the Armenian genocide, it is crucially important to give voice to these individuals and listen to their stories. And I conclude with this photo of Armenian orphans that were survivors of genocide who were sheltered in the Caucasus, in Yerevan, in 1915-16. And the reason I chose this picture is because these were children who survived coming from Van, and we actually have their stories in writing. I will conclude with this. Thank you for your attention.
Much, Asya. It was a really incredible introduction, and we're actually going to move to Silvina for her portion of it, and then we'll move on from there.
Thank you so much. I am really delighted to be here with you and to share some of the stories I was collecting through my artistic practice and archival practice. Yeah, the first image that you see, as I said, as an artist, I work since the beginning with my own history as grandchild of survivors of Armenian genocide. And what you see now is a work that I did, is called The Texture of Memory, and is in fact a second step. The first step was when I found a suitcase with the documents, refugee documents and photographs of my grandparents, and had a kind of aha moment, because there were so many questions in the air that never had an answer. And suddenly when I saw this materiality in the papers and in the photographs, I began to understand between the lines, or I began to, like through the materiality of these objects, the void between these traces became more palpable, let's say. So I began to see also other archives of other families, and then I began to work with an archive that I will later tell the name, Hushamadian. So one of the outcomes of the collecting different elements, in this case are photographs, is this kind of carpet. This carpet is called families, and as Asya explained before, Armenian families are scattered in the world, and through the act of crocheting them together, I try to bring the families to experience, in a sense, the togetherness that we lost as people. So you see now, this is the whole carpet and details. These are all families. They are not my family, but are all from the different cities that you saw also in the map, that from the Ottoman Empire, that were displaced and etc. For example, this one is from my own collection. These are the refugee documents of my grandparents. Something that was very striking to me, to see the diversity of languages of the Ottoman Empire, and also through the languages, they had documents from France, from Lebanon, so all these languages and diversity, and also at the same time to understand the way of the refugee, how they are passing through places and letting their own trace in that place, and also taking an imprint from that place where they were going through. This, for example, is called Marash schools. From one side, from my family is from Marash, today called Karaman Marash. And I was also very, very impressed about the educational power that these cities in the eastern provinces had. And when I present these carpets, you can read the sources of the photographs, and you see Central College, all the different names of the college that had, let's say, a religious ground from the Protestants or from the Catholics, French, American, German. So very interesting, and to see how developed the education was in those provinces was a very interesting experience to me as grandchild. Or, for example, this is called Harpert Traits, and this is about a city called Harpert at that time. Today, this zone, the city is called Elazik. And also you see all the different traits in these old photographs that were that are in the archives, because Armenians were very well known for the traits. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, it's a way to reconstruct. It's about the life of the Armenians before they were killed. And this is something that very long we were not looking to, how our grandparents lived. We were so quiet, obsessed with their death, but we had very little, let's say, we put little attention on how they were living, and all this is so important. So this is one of the outcomes, these carpets. What you are seeing now is also the outcome of performative work. Through this archive where I work, I am the artistic director called Hushamadian. I work with historians, Dr. Vahe Tahchian and Elke Hartman, but we are a big team, each person writing the different articles and the different specialties. We go to different cities of the diaspora and invite people to contribute with their own memories, because we are making the texture through, like it's like every story is like a thread, and we are putting these stories together. And this is one workshop I did in Glendale, in LA, in the library of Glendale. We invited people to participate, and they brought their stories. We sat together. I had some assistance. We could write down the stories and make the crochet together and bring the pieces together to remake the texture. Yeah. And what I was talking about, this is the homepage called Hushamadian. Hushamadian is the means memory book. And in the Hushamadians, there is a genre with over 300 books. You have from different villages and cities the memories written down by survivors in different places of where they found shelter. Could be in Lebanon, could be in France. There are also one or two from in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. So I invite you also to visit the page, because as you see, we have different categories, from music to you can access the information through different gates, let's say. Can be music, can be videos, can be articles, and also the Open Digital Archive, where we also collect stories and put the stories from the survivors with their own materiality, photographs, and so on. So another, what I wanted to explain today is all the different ways how it's possible to put in circulation the archives and touch the people and motivate the people to be part of the archive for a culture that was erased. Thank God was not completely erased, but quiet. So this is, for example, one piece of art I did with music that we were collecting from the archives, old Armenian music, but also from the 30s, 40s. I had my own collection from my grandfather. He was a musician also. And it was in the frame of a festival in Germany, where people can come and in the foyer of the theater, instead of listening, I don't know, contemporary music, they could listen to archival music, Armenian archival music. This is another way to put the archive in circulation. It's called Object That Tell Stories. And I developed with objects that we were getting like slowly people, because the Hushamadian was found in 2010. So with the years, the people knew about us and they were sending us the objects and the stories. So I did this installation with 21 postcards. In the front side, you have the object. In the back side, you have the story of the object and where is now, from which village came, and how the family did to survive. Like short, of course, it's a postcard, and everybody could take the postcard with. And it is an art installation also, so that it can be always recreate, and the people take the postcards with them, and there's a kind of interaction. Another way to put the archive in circulation is to do short film. This film I did about, it's called Hajan Siktum Agoe. It's about the dialect of Hajan. And I have now 1 minute video, so you can put play so that you can listen.
Ուրեմն գահավակվեին, ջիդապուրը գնեին, ալայիկը պրնեին, ամեն ձերերը ձերքի, միասին գերքեին կպարեին ձերերը, քիշերվնեգը սկսեին, հաջնոջիշտ մեջտեղը գետրոնը, բոլոր ժողովուրդը հոն գահավակվեր, գրագը կվարեր, միսերը ոչխարները գմորթվեին, միսերը գխաշեին, Արաբը կպատրաստեին մեծ կիները, վերջը ջիդապուրը մինչև արդու կխարնեին, հետո եկեղեցին քանան ու քարկորդներ, ամեն մարդ իր տուն են թենջերը մգարներ, բնակ մգարներ, կերթար կլեցներ տունը կպերել, արդու կանող բոլոր ժողովուրդին կփաշնեին։
This is another short, it's a new video that is not published yet. It's about the dialect of the Diyarbakir, we say Dikranagert in Armenian. Today they call the capital of Kurdistan, but it was an old Armenian city and had a big Armenian population too. But I wanted to share also, this one is based on a novel from Meguerditchian called Our Names, in English, Yavur Mahallesi. Please put the play again.
Խնոն մայրս էր։ Խանում էր անունը, հայրս իրեն խնոգս էր։ 13 տարեկանին հորս հետ ամուսնանալի հետո, մորս խանումությունը վերջացած, խնոյության շրջանը սկսած էր։ Արդեն մեր այդ կողմերը Դիկրանագերդի մեջ, երբ աղջիկները ամուսնանան, իրենց անուններն ալ կփոխվին։ Խաչերը գլա խճե, արշալույսը էրշո, Եղիսապետը էղսո, նվարդնալ նվո։ Աղջիկներու անունները երբ այլևս գնոջական անուններու կփոխվին, անոնց բարդականություններն ալ կշատնան, կբազմանան։ Կուսական անունները երբ այլևս գնոջական անուններու կվերածվին, իրենց առաջին բարդականությունը ալ բազմանալ ու շատնալ է։ Նախ կստիվին կոնե 2 տարին անգամը զավակ ծնիլ։ Անշուշտ լավ եւ քովելի է, որ գիմը ավելի շատ մանչ զավակ ծնի, փոխանակ աղջիկի։
And the last one that I want to present is something also very interesting. It's a cooperation with the dancer where she tried to find through movement a connection. She's also a third generation, but in her family they were Islamicized, but they understood that they had Armenian roots. So the grandchild, she was trying to connect with the movement of the Armenian dancing. So we create 2 spaces. In one space I did a kind of museum, let's say, and in the other space where the dance. So I had the carpets there and I had different projections. Here you can see one very short minute from their dancing. Mm-hmm. Contemporary dance, they are trying to reenact the photographs, for example, there, but then they are combining with Armenian traditional dancing. This is, for example, a 12-channel installation with different people from Armenians from the world dancing. I collect from YouTube, and you have different Armenian communities that do their traditional dances from Sydney to Buenos Aires to Lebanon, France. and they were without music. It was a eerie atmosphere, and at the same time, it was a dramaturgy. I did a performance. This performance was the word in German, the word together, zusammen, and I was combing the word together. Another one was quite the end of the part of my performance where people was quite shocked that I was cherishing the old images, but then at the same time, in one moment, I begin to eat one of the photographs, like incorporating the heritage in a way. It's a violent way, but in a sense, it's also, I don't know, kind of transformation. And to finish, because I am almost with my time, 1 minute, in this ambient, you had different projections and also different moments. And this I wanted to share at the last Dancing for the Ancestors. I was filming in Buenos Aires, one of the Armenian groups. We have kind of 5 or 6 Armenian dancing groups in Buenos Aires, and I combined them with images of our ancestors. And if you want to see, you can go to my website in the video category, then you can find it. This is only was a minute, but this is a little bit longer, so I just cut a minute, but then I'm finishing. Thank you very much for listening to me.
I wanted to just mention, since Silvina spoke about it, this space in Glendale, if anybody's interested, one of the artists that we have also in the show is running that, is curating that space. The gentleman, there's a 2-part artist, are showing Eyewitness. And I also want to say Still Dancing, which Silvina showed, will also be in the exhibition in the fall. And so you'll be able to actually see it in completion as well. All right, so next up, I believe we have on the roster, we have Deanna. So I think we have Susan and Allan next, and I will say for all the artists, really check out the chat, because there's actually some really incredible comments and compliments coming in, so take some time with that as well. So Susan and Allan, it's your floor.
Thank you very much for inviting us here today, and thank you for those of you who are attending. I want to give special thanks to Dr. Siegel and his whole team for organizing this wonderful event, and especially for your interest, continuing interest in the Armenian Genocide and Armenian studies in general. Here, we're Allan and I, my brother Allan and I are here to talk about our aunt, Mary Zakharyan, and we wrote a book about her and about our family, but mostly concentrating on Mary. We wrote a book about her and the effect of the genocide and her mother's experiences in particular on her. Mary is our mother's sister. Here you can see her, Aunt Mary, as many people remember her. She was smiling, exhibiting her paintings. But the portrait in the center of this slide, it's Mary's self-portrait. It's her view of herself, and that perhaps tells a fuller story. On the surface, Mary was talented, charming, beautiful. She was a successful artist and teacher. She had her own art school and taught and mentored hundreds of students from the Philadelphia area over the years. But there was another side to her, one that was troubled by anxiety, agoraphobia, hypervigilance, fear of the outside world, as well as an overdeveloped sense of guilt. Now, not coincidentally, these are symptoms experienced by her mother, Adek, our grandmother, who was a survivor of the 1915 genocide of the Armenians. So in the course of writing our book, we realized this very strong connection of symptoms and disposition between our Aunt Mary and our grandmother, Adek. And it became apparent that PTSD, or the post-traumatic stress experienced by Arek, was transmitted to her children, inherited by her children. This influence was especially strong in Mary, who was probably more sensitive and emotionally, maybe I should just say emotionally fragile than her siblings. And she absorbed all of this, all of these symptoms, all the anxiety, and her disposition was largely shaped by the genocide and her mother's experience. So we found that Mary and her mother presented sort of a microcosm in which one can examine the survivor experience, the immigrant experience, and the legacy of genocidal trauma. Mary's inner life was shaped essentially by her complex relationship with her mother. The two women demonstrate the idea, as was already spoken about, that a traumatic event like genocide reverberates for many years after the actual event. In fact, looking at the political and psychological situation today, one can see that the Armenian Genocide over 100 years later is still an open wound for both the victims and the perpetrators. Before we talk a little more about Mary's life and art, let us take you back in time to the early 20th century, to Eastern Turkey, where our grandparents, Mary's parents, were born and raised. And Allan will tell you a little about our grandfather, Moses Zakharyan.
These photographs are of our grandfather, Moses Zakarian, with his musical instruments. He was born in a town called Hunus, which is in present-day Turkey. It's known as Hinis, Hinis, in 1881. He was a weaver by trade, but his life was mainly revolved around his avocation of playing music. He played primarily two Middle Eastern instruments, the nar and the zurna. They're both double reed instruments that are similar to the oboe. Now, in the old country, in Ottoman Turkey, he married and had 4 children. But in 1913, now this is a year before World War I started, he came to the United States in order to work in the industrial plants here and make money, and then presumably to return to Turkey. And he had also left his homeland in order to evade being drafted into the Ottoman army, since the Armenian conscripts were generally placed in the most vulnerable positions in combat, as they had been in the recent Balkan Wars. His intention eventually was to go back to his family in Tunis, as I said, but because the 1915 genocide intervened, he was unable to return. And his family, as far as we know, were lost, were killed in the genocide, or some other fate befell them. We don't really know. I mean, they could have changed their names, been converted, emigrated to another country, but he never knew their fate. Now, in this slide, we see Mary's paintings of her father late in life. I think that the one on the right is particularly moving, as it just shows the survivor experience, that he was, even though he was outwardly a pleasant man, I mean, he had been traumatized by it, as others had been. And I just wanted to comment briefly about what the phenomenon that Moses Zakarian illustrates, those who were victimized by genocide indirectly and who survived, though their families were lost. And as we said, Moses never saw his first wife or children again. It's probable that they were killed in 1915. And then in the US, some years later, he married the woman who was to become Susan's and my grandmother, Arek Kocharyan, and she had also lost her entire first family in Turkey in 1915. So Susan will now tell you a little bit more about her.
This is our grandmother, Adek's Turkish passport. The year then was 1923, when she finally was able to get out of Turkey. In 1915, she was 20 years old. She was married and had 2 small sons. Her husband and children were killed. And once, only once, she confided in her cousin's wife that she had seen her 2 little boys beheaded with an axe. Adek somehow survived. She never spoke very specifically of how or what happened to her in the 8 long years she wandered through Turkey and finally found passage to America in 1923. And you can see on this passport, you can see it's in French and in Turkish. On the next slide, these are 2 photos of our grandmother. The left one was probably taken shortly before she was able to get to the United States. And the one on the right is probably, it's undated, but we think it's from the 1940s. That's how we remember our grandmother. I mean, this is a younger version of what we remember. She was, I mean, we're going to talk a lot about her, the trauma she suffered and how it affected her. But to us, she was a loving grandmother. And in retrospect, we're amazed that after her ordeal, she was able to achieve some degree of healing, enough that she could successfully raise 4 children in America and come to love this country. On the next slide, we see 2 early photos, or I'm sorry, no, 2 early portraits by Mary of her mother, who was her most frequent subject. These were probably done in the late 1950s. Now here's a short excerpt from our book about our grandmother. To say our grandmother, Adek Zakharyan's grief was unspoken is only partially true. She spoke it with her large, dark, heavy-lidded eyes, with her frequent sighs, and with her slow, limping gait. She told almost no one the specifics of her experiences in the massacre and its aftermath. No one, that is, except her youngest and most temperamental daughter, Mary, to whom she intermittently revealed fragments of her past experience at Mary's prodding, it seems. Adek's relationship with Mary was both the closest and the most fraught of any other in her American life, founded in love, but causing both of them much pain. Mary believed that her connection to her mother was the source of her art and also the source of her own suffering. We say here on at the bottom of this slide that traits that Mary shared with her mother included sporadic depression and agoraphobia, anxiety, and overwhelming survivor guilt. Allan will talk about the next chapter here.
Yes, here we have a photograph of the Zakharyan family sometime in the 1930s, the mid to late 30s, at a picnic, which was a frequent event for the Armenian diaspora to engage in. One time that they could have fun on a Sunday afternoon. But what this to me symbolizes is the Depression years overall, and the fact that our grandparents escaped discrimination and genocide, but in the US, they were confronted with economic hardship. The Great Depression affected them at least as much as other working class families. Moses had opened a tailor shop in Philadelphia, but eventually the family had to go on relief, as public assistance was usually termed at that time. In the photo, we can see here from left to right, we see Mary, see her mother Adek, our grandmother. Next is Susan's and my mother, Rose. Then our grandfather, Moses. Then the boy in the family, Paul, the youngest. And then the in-between sister, Sosie, on the right. And I just wanted to comment here that the fortunes of this family, just kind of like the US or the the developed world overall during the 1930s and early 1940s were variable. I mean, up and down. The onset of World War II ironically meant the end of the Depression. It meant an economic upturn in the US. And the Zakharyan family also made out relatively well and were able to move to a middle-class neighborhood in the 1940s when they had been, in such depressed economic conditions before that. They were able to, as I said, relocate to a middle-class neighborhood in Northeast Philadelphia, and that was to be the house that Mary continued to live in until 2006, when she injured herself in her home, and then we had to move her to an apartment. Next slide here. These are some of the more, I would say, outstanding pictures, paintings from Mary's relatively early years. She enrolled in art school when she was in her 20s, in the 1950s. After having worked at a series of unsatisfying jobs, basically, she didn't really know what she wanted to do with herself. And then she did realize that art was her primary interest. Now, her early paintings didn't show any special interest in genocide themes, though, as one can see from these examples here, there is a brooding intensity dominating many of them, and affinity also for an expressionist use of color. And Mary very often noted that there was a dichotomy within her own work, which she related to the different moods of her parents. There was a lighthearted sensibility that she believed that she expressed at times, that she associated with her father and his music. And on the other hand, the darker side associated with her mother's unhappiness and trauma. Now, in the next slide, we see some additional early paintings by Mary. And what my feeling about it is, in spite of her own judgment about her work, I think that the happier and untroubled side of her spirit is really seldom in evidence, even in paintings that are, about relatively neutral subjects. It was more later in her work, and particularly, I think, after her mother died in the early 1970s, that Mary began focusing more explicitly on the themes of genocide and victims of genocide. So in the next slide, Susan will continue with a description of the progression of her artistry.
So as Mary's artistry progressed, so did all of the conflicts in her. And Allan alluded to this push and pull between the two sides of her character. And if you read that quote, which is from one of her journals, she said, "Every once in a while, my father's music drowned out my mother's sorrow, and feelings of joy stirred within me, but they were short-lived. I was left with feelings of guilt, feelings of betrayal to my mother's pain." These are happy paintings, I think. There's movement, there's color, they're upbeat, and Mary attributes that to her father. But although Moses, and one way to explain it, Moses suffered heartache, obviously, from the loss of his first family back in the old country, but he was not a victim of the atrocities in Turkey, nor did he witness them. He was safely ensconced in the US at the time, and the horrors were only an abstraction to him. He presented as a happy man who loved to play his music. But our grandmother, on the other hand, was stuck in this cycle of trying to forget and then having these memories come back and haunt her. And I think that this quote from Mary is a perfect description of survivor guilt. And she felt she was not entitled to be happy because her mother was in pain. These are, this is the flip side of the work. She did say, and this is again from her journal, you can see the writing at the bottom, her sorrow lives in me, my inheritance etched in my very being, in my veins, my blood, we're one and the same.
Yes, this relates partly to what I was mentioning a moment ago about her interest in specifically Armenian themes occurring in the 1970s. Although I had said at the time of her mother's death, which was in 1974, but 3 years before that, in 71, she took a trip to Soviet Armenia, and this more than anything, I think, was the fountainhead of this inspiration, that she had to do Armenian subjects. She wished to fulfill the ethnocentric goals that were inculcated in her generation of American Armenians, the children of the genocide survivors. And painting scenes from Armenia was also one of the few things in her life for which she felt that her mother would support her. Throughout her life, she always felt that she felt disapproval from her mother, rarely felt the kind of warmth that she expected or wanted. As you can see from the paintings here in this slide, the subjects range from medieval cathedrals. In the next slide, you'll see recently constructed monuments. She did several paintings of Mount Ararat. The one here in the center of this slide, the birth of Ararat, I think is one of the most striking of those. And Ararat not only is a national symbol for the Armenians, but of course it's also a universally mythic trope of rebirth and fulfillment, given the account in scripture of the landing of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. Now, the next, I guess Susan will describe this next screen for you.
This is a shot of a portion of Mary's journal. She scribbled like that. And, you know, the exhilaration of the Armenia trip lasted a short while. And Mary had a lot of success with the paintings that emerged from that. She sold many, many paintings to Armenians, especially, of that trip to Armenia, where she had taken her camera and her sketch pad and was just obsessed with capturing everything she could, brought all that back and painted and painted and painted, and had a huge exhibition several years later. But she became unsettled again, and as her mother aged, she revealed bits and pieces of her experiences to Mary, who prodded her to do so. She talked about blood up to her ankles. She said she didn't speak Armenian for 2 years. She said she bargained with the Turkish soldiers to let her live. Of course, she had too much shame to reveal the certain sexual abuse she suffered at the hands of those carrying out the death marches and killings. You know, we acknowledge now that one of the major tools in genocide is sexual abuse and rape of women. Something else that happened, our grandmother had slit earlobes, and she said that her little brother pulled her earrings off, and that's why her earlobes were split. But we know now, and especially hearing accounts of other survivors, that the Turkish soldiers pulled the earrings down and to steal their earrings and split their earlobes. So here we have Mary saying, "Oh God, I thought if only I could get to the bottom of her soul and find out all the pain and ache that was stored there. I couldn't stand Mother's suffering so. Lately, she had been worried more than ever before, and then would come that sigh, and I'd wonder what painful event she was feeling. When we go to the next slide, we see 4 depictions of Mary's mother. There are many more that she did, but here are 4 of them. And this is Mary's the only other surviving self-portrait that we have of her. So she was endlessly searching for her mother, and the search was apparent in every portrait that she created of her mother and also of others. And it was very interesting when Mary spent her last years in a nursing home with dementia, and we visited her all the time. When she, we hung her paintings on the wall of her nursing home room. We picked out paintings to hang there. None of her mother, though. But we had 2 paintings of women hanging up, and we would ask her, who is that? And she'd say, my mother. Well, she had dementia, but still, that just crystallizes this search for her mother. And the next painting is Allan will speak about.
Yes, this portrait of 5 heads of her mother, titled My Mother's Endless Lament. This I think is what Mary considered her most important work, or at least her most important portrait of her mother. It emphasizes this circular arrangement. It emphasizes the unresolved trauma of genocide. And on a deeper level, one can say that it symbolizes a cyclic process in history in which violent events repeat themselves. Now, she had at one point considered placing her own image in the center of this painting, but then she decided against it for reasons that are not exactly clear to me. She also once likened this painting to the painting, The Brooklyn Crucifixion, in Chaim Potok's novel, My Name is Asher Lev. So that's, I think, very significant thing that she sees her mother here as an emblem of humanity's suffering. Next slide, Susan, would you talk about this one?
With these, we just picked out these 2. We have many portraits that Mary did. This on the left is an unnamed refugee, and we think the one on the right, a Holocaust survivor, is one of her most powerful. She titled it, Out of the Depths Have I Cried Unto Thee, O Lord, quoting Psalm 130. This portrait was loosely based on a genocide survivor that she knew and that we knew also. So that is, we think, one of her most powerful paintings, based on a genocide survivor that she knew and that we knew also.
Portraits here is a good illustration,
we think,
of Mary's wish to portray the whole family of men, different nationalities, different races. Portraits here. So she wasn't focusing just on the Armenian experience. Mary's wish to she tended to focus, though, in general, the whole family of men, different peoples who have been nationalities, historically marginalized and oppressed. So she wasn't focusing just on the Armenian experience, those of African descent, of American Indian. She tended to focus, though, in general, on Jewish and Asian different descent, peoples who have been. Her wish was to historically marginalize every man and every woman. Specifically, the next those slide, of African descent, of American Indian.
We have some slides here, 2 slides of
Jewish and
more
Asian
direct
descent,
references
and her
to
wish was to
the
celebrate
genocide.
every man and every woman.
We have a theory that it was.
Now, in the next slide,
there's not much violence depicted in her work. We have some slides here, 2 slides too disruptive to her and to more her mother, direct references psychologically to the genocide, to depict the violence. we have a theory that
becomes sorrow more than anything
there's not
else.
much violence
These
depicted
mixed
in her
media
works,
works,
because that probably would have been too
you can
disruptive
if
to
you
her
can
and
see
to her mother,
the
to
newspaper clippings, they have to do with
depict the violence.
They have to do with the
becomes
in
sorrow
the late 80s
more than anything else.
These
Conflict
mixed
then
media
with
works,
Azerbaijan, which is
you can
continuing to
if
this
you can
day,
see
which,
the newspaper clippings,
Armenians
they have to
just
do with
lost
the genocide.
territory in
They
the
have to
fall
do
to
with
Azerbaijan.
in the late 80s,
Outlined conflict then with
portraits
Azerbaijan
in the
which
right,
is
in the
continuing to
painting
this
on the
day,
right, or
which
the work on the right, are of
Armenians just lost
Komidas Bartabed,
territory in
who
the fall
was
to Azerbaijan.
an Armenian
The
priest,
outlined
composer, musician, portraits
and Armenians
right,
consider him a martyr.
painting on the right,
Or the
he
work on the right
was
are
driven
of,
mad by what he
Komidas
witnessed
Bartabed
in the
who
genocide,
was
and he
an
died
Armenian priest
some years later,
composer,
in a Paris
musician.
asylum. And Armenians
Next
consider him a
slide.
martyr. He was driven mad
The
by
one
what
on
he
the left,
witnessed
Shadows in the Desert,
in the
these
genocide,
are
and
Armenian
he
women praying on a death march.
died
Death marches
some years later
from Eastern
in a
Turkey
Paris
south
asylum.
to Syria.
And the one on the
Next
right
slide.
is an imagined work.
The one on the left,
looks like it
Shadows
could be
in the Desert,
incomplete,
these
but
are
Mary
Armenian women
exhibited
praying
it,
on a
so
death
we believe
march.
she
These
meant
death
it to be
marches
complete.
from Eastern
Um,
Turkey south to
It's
Syria.
imagined because
And the one on
that's
the right is
picture of
an
her mother
imagined
work
grieving, mourning
in front of
it looks like it could be incomplete,
a memorial
but Mary
to Armenian
exhibited
martyrs,
it,
so
in
we believe
Bikfaya,
she meant it to
Lebanon.
be
Mary had
complete.
seen that monument. Of
It's
course, her mother
imagined
did not,
because
but
that's picture of her mother
that's a work she created.
grieving, mourning in
In her
front
late
of
paintings,
a
Mary
memorial
Zakarian's
to Armenian
style
martyrs
became one
in
she
Bikfaya,
termed
Lebanon.
line and
Mary had
design.
seen that monument.
As you
Of
can see from this one painting, it's quite different, both technique and subject, from the works that she had painted throughout most of her life. There was a kind of streamlining or a paring down of her style, different use of color, different subject matter. There's an implication here in this change of a kind of resolution and fulfillment. If I might analogize this with music, it's somewhat similar to the transformed or transfigured style of Beethoven's late period. What we see here, I think we can lead to our conclusion overall about Mary's life and her work and its relation to genocidal trauma or to the phenomenon of genocide. And both her life and art represent a parallel to the genocide itself, which, as we wrote in our book, is a psychic wound that will not heal, and as many people today continue to observe. Yet the catastrophe of 1915 is both a destroyer and a creator. And now I'll quote somewhat extensively from the conclusion of our book, as the conclusion of our presentation here about Mary. We wrote, "An oppressed and victimized group's wish, either conscious or not, is that the suffering endured will make them greater than they would have been in its absence. For the nations forced to become part of the Ottoman realm, Greeks, Serbs, other Slavic peoples, Armenians, and others, the fact of their having been defeated gave them the conviction that they were greater in defeat than the Ottoman forces who triumphed over them. This is the essence of tragedy. One is beaten, but is somehow superior to the forces that have brought one down. This feeling is not just at the root of Mary Zakarian's paintings, but within the hearts of the people of all backgrounds she sought to represent and to memorialize. For having made herself and her art an emblem of not just her people, but of every shade of the brotherhood of man, she succeeded in the task she set for herself. The completion and consummation of an artist's work represents both an end and a beginning." Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. I'm also going to just quickly, I know we put it in there before, but that's a link to the book that Allan and Susan have been talking about. It's a really wonderful book to read about the story of Mary. And so I just wanted to make sure that we added that right afterwards.
Thanks.
One of the things that I wanted to do now is we do have some questions that have come in privately and also to the group. So I figured I'd just kind of go through a few of them since I think that, and also anybody who has additional questions, feel free to put into the chat. And so the first thing that I wanted to ask, and this is kind of collectively, so whoever wants to answer it can. The question was, trauma, memory, and resilience are really different, are really difficult subjects to address. So as a panel, what strategies have you used to be able to address those ideas? And how do you approach the visualization of that with difficult subject matter? I think that's something that we talk about to our students a lot, is how do you tackle a really difficult and sometimes very deeply personal topic in a way that sort of reaches out and kind of allows people to understand it. So if anybody can share some of their insights and how they do that, I think that would be wonderful.
I just wanted to say that I think when you approach disturbing or upsetting subject matter, as we did in this book, something about the process of writing about it allows you to work through it a little bit, and it becomes less frightening and less scary as you confront it. At least that's what one thing that I found.
Yes, I would say this is it's a long process. In my case, I use beauty to be able to speak about these complicated and painful issues, because aesthetic and anesthetic, in a sense, you need to if you want to speak about your pain, but you are not in the cabinet of your psychologist, you are speaking to a wide audience. In a sense, you need to catch them, and what I try to do is to create an environment where it's possible to process what you are telling, what you are speaking about, and not to shock. I mean, this is my strategy, not to shock people. I would not use the shocking strategy. There are other artists that use that, but it's not my way.
I think it's such an interesting idea too, because I think Mariana and I had spoke about this a little bit too, where when you're dealing with difficult subjects, you're trying not to re-traumatize your audience, right? You're trying to get to them, but not, put them into harm's way. And so it's this really fine balance between that. I think that's a really great point. And to kind of follow up on that, we had a couple of comments come in for Silvina about the carpets. And someone asked, how long does it take to make one of those? And I'm curious too, because they're so elaborate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it depends. It depends if it's a carpet that I do in communion with other people. For example, the carpet in Los Angeles, it was a workshop situation, and we were 3 days together, but we were working at the same time. I had 2 assistants, and all of them were women, I have to say. The women were sitting around the table, and while one was telling the story and the other listening, another one was writing down, for example, the story of the second person, and making the scans and printing and laminating, and then we began with the wool. So it was one thing, but all in all, but we had, because we had an exhibition. Normally, if you don't have the deadline that you have to exhibit what you did, you can work in maybe to do that carpet 3 days. but we wanted to exhibit, and then we did 2 carpets in 3 days, but I have to work a lot, like 14, 15 hours each day. So, but if you do it like normal, like 5, 6 hours a day, together with 2, 3 persons, then yeah, it depends. Then if it's a carpet that has to do with the concept, for example, I don't know, I have another Urfa traits, or I have another in the make that is about the first flower seller from Aleppo. It was an Armenian. I found some subjects that I think they are worth to be communicated in this form. So I have the first all the time of scanning the images and working, because I work with the archive. I don't take the archive as a Bible that you don't touch. I try, sometimes when I retouch images, they are so torn away, the colors, but then when I retouch, things appeared from the back of the images, like objects or faces, or it's incredible. So it is my way to reconstruct. So I have to work on every image. That takes also some days, laminate and so on. Sometimes when I have a little bit of money, I can ask some people that work with me to make the handwork with me. Sometimes I do a workshop or a performance, so it depends. But for one carpet, between concept, it could take 5 days, it could take 10 days, it depends.
So I actually, a question came in that's actually a little bit related to that. Someone asked how you collected, in what places you collected the pictures and the artifacts. Like, where did that material come from that you're creating the pieces with?
Yes, I mean, I did this collection or recollection events myself, but also my colleagues from Hushamadian. I will write also the name of the website so that everybody has it. They did, for example, I read a direct, no, I have to put to everybody. I will do that later. They did in Lebanon, they did in Greece. You approach the communities, the Armenian communities. In the US, of course, also my colleagues did in the region of Boston and New York. Myself, because I am born in Argentina, I know the Armenian community from Buenos Aires very well. I did it in Buenos Aires, in LA. I did also once in Vienna. So it depends. And at the same time, like it has a kind of feedback effect, since our project is 11 years old. With the time, people listen about us and they see, because the Open Digital Archive became a place for memory for the families. You know, our families, they don't have graves. I mean, they are in the desert. So in a sense, to pay respect and honor the life stories of them, to go, if you go in Hushamadian, in the Open Digital Archive, you will see, in a sense of reinscribe our stories in a place. They have a place to be now. So it has a aspect of healing also. Yes.
Yeah, and that actually brings up a question that anybody can kind of field, but the idea of that trauma being passed down through generations, and the impacts of things like immigration, to preserve Armenian culture through children and grandchildren. Like, what kind of impact did that have on your family? Was that something that you spoke about? Was that something that was important? In what ways did you find that to be part of your upbringing, to sort of keep Armenian life and experience alive as you were sort of going through the different generations?
Susan or Allan, you speak, and then I can say something about it.
Alan, you want to say something?
No, I think that each succeeding generation of Armenian Americans has had a kind of a different situation in the attempt to, or the requirement kind of to perpetuate some focus upon the ethnic group. And Susan and I were touched by that, but not in the same way that the previous generation was. And to some extent, I think that with third generation Americans, there is more of a drive towards doing other things, but then later in life, we may, to make up for lost time, we may refocus then on the ethnic history. And so I think that some of the things that I've realized are about how a lot of what we were told about the Armenians by our parents or grandparents was not really contextualized into broader, just human universal issues. And the more I've learned about the Armenian genocide, the more I've tended to see it not only as one in obviously a series of similar catastrophes that have afflicted many ethnic groups, but also just kind of like a paradigm of unfortunately of the violence that's endemic in human society. And so it's just a continuously learning experience. The more one reads about this or about anything, the more one learns, and you never stop learning.
Right. Well, and I just want to follow up that, Susan and Allan were kind enough to let Mariana and I into their archives. And I feel like the idea of retirement must have been such an incredible experience to be able to finally go through all of that material. And just, I'm sure Allan has, Susan, you had this amazing organization, but I imagine going back and seeing all of that and learning through the letters and getting the things translated, that so much more was coming from that too. I thought that was really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Well, first of all, I organized all that because I knew you were coming. Yeah, that's why I organized it. And it was good because that forced me to organize it. I think that it's just, and another reason that I have all of that is that when Mary died, well, first when we moved Mary out of her apartment or out of her house into an apartment, we acquired a lot of her stuff. And then when we moved her to a nursing home, we acquired all of it. And she was somebody who saved everything. I don't know whether her siblings would have saved as much as she did, but because she lived with her mother, she never married, never had children. She lived with her mother until her mother died in the early 70s. She had access to all of this. She saved it all. She saved everything. And we then retired and had to sort through it all. And we for instance, when we cleaned out her house, there were piles and piles and piles of journals. And, we didn't plan to write a book. And some of those journals we just could not keep, but we kept enough that we got a sense of what she had, how she chronicled her life and her mother's life.
That's correct.
And I can add also, I'm sure all of you know the concept of a post-memory coined by Marianne Hirsch. And me in the third generation, I grew up with my grandmother who was in the deportations, Agamni, and I got the task, don't forget and don't let the world forget about our pain as child. So what I try to do with my own son, because I feel that I don't have a choice. With the art, I try to transform the painting in something else. In art, activism, different channels, let's say, but I don't want to transfer, if it's possible, but you can't. I mean, he got that I am very engaged in this, but what I try to do is to approach him to the Armenian culture through other channels, like music, for example. He learned to play the qanun. My grandfather Abedis, he played the qanun, and this is my way, like a constructive way, and not, you know, this sad, this heavy weight that still in third generation, even if they are not my own memories, are inherited memories that I have on my shoulders. So.
And that brings up another question that actually came up. Do you see through the experiences of your families, talking about passing things down, especially, have you seen some of the same, issues of depression, anxiety? Does that sort of pass along too, not just sort of the memory and the trauma? Do you find that that history impacts you as well in those ways, or you see elements of it?
I believe it does, and I've heard from other third generation people that they feel the same way, that maybe we have a higher rate of OCD than the average population, or we have higher rate of anxiety. It's interesting to think about that. That would be another whole book to write. But I believe that psychic mentality, the weight on the shoulders of our ancestors, I believe it is passed down.
And, I think we're going to probably conclude in a minute, but I do want to end with one question that I think kind of speaks a little bit to our school and in Stockton in general. And the question came up that, we have so many different students, especially students and professors and staff who are here from all different majors and from all different disciplines. And so the question came up is, how do you imagine other people, not just artists, can use the work that you're doing to sort of help inform their research or their understanding of that? Do you see this as being interdisciplinary, and that, if you're a writer, you're impacting painting and photography? If you're a multimedia artist, you're impacting historical accounts. Like, where do you see that sort of happening? Because so many of our students are sort of using this content, and, I was just sort of curious about how might they use this artwork and this writing in their work as well? How do you see it in the future?
I definitely think that what we've talked about, and certainly what Allan and I wrote about, is can inform field of psychology, sociology, psychology, psychiatry, because I think what we have done is sort of, while we're not doctors, we're not formal psychiatrists or analysts in that sense, but what we've done is lay out, I think, a case study of a child of a survivor, and not that every child of a survivor behaves or has the same character as Mary, but this is, I think, studying her as a way to inform the study of survivors in general. They might not be as extreme, as affected as she has been, but I think that survivors of trauma, and it doesn't have to be genocidal trauma, survivors of trauma can learn something, I think, by studying somebody like Mary. And another thing I wanted to say is that when we talk about PTSD, we're talking about, we can be talking about somebody who's had one event, an accident, an invasion, something like that. There's a phenomenon called complex trauma, complex PTSD, and that would be, I think, something that applies to certainly the Armenian survivors, because it was not one event, it was a prolonged, years-long kind of event. It wasn't just over in one day. So that's another phenomenon, I think, that could be studied more closely.
So
Not to forget the trauma that is continued to inflict in third and fourth generation, the fact that the perpetrator still denies the crime.
That's true, and it's going to be interesting to see what President Biden's declaration from Saturday, what effect that has on the Armenian psyche and also the Turkish psyche. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that unfolds, whether it makes a difference or not.
So I think that's a great place to actually end. I just want to do a final remark of just saying thank you so much to all the panelists, especially Silvina, who's in Germany right now, and it's very, very late. So we appreciate your time so much, and everybody who's just contributed to it. I also want to just do a small thank you to Morgan and Raz and Mariana, who absolutely, this would not have happened without all their help and without all their assistance. So I just want to say thank you. And to everybody who attended, we had a really great attendance to this. So I'm really, really excited. Thank you for joining us tonight. And also, I hope I see you in the fall, because the exhibition goes up in September 7th. We will have events and you will hear me talking a lot, but I will try to make you look at the art more than that. It's going to be a really incredible 2 months. So please make sure you visit us, you see the exhibition. We're so excited to show you what we have. All right, so thank you everybody so much. Thank you to the panelists, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you to everybody, and thank you. Good night.
Thanks.
Good night. Thank you.